Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at the History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at thehistoryguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. Today, the History Guy tells two stories of state borders in the U.S. The first is the long history of Missouri's borders, which were deeply entwined with American politics of the period. Then, the History Guy will tell you about the time that Ohio and Michigan went to war over the border between them, and how despite not participating, Wisconsin lost the most. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
The United States really is a vast nation. Its 9.8 million square kilometers is roughly the equivalent of the entire continent of Europe. If you take an airplane from New York to Los Angeles, it's about a 4,500 kilometer trip. By comparison, a trip from London to Moscow is only about 2,800 kilometers. And of course, if you fly from New York to Los Angeles, then you're going to fly over what is often and somewhat derisively called flyover country. But of course, each of those states in the vast middle of America was at one point the American frontier, and they are all important to American history. But one in particular really became the dividing line, the marker between East and West and North and South. The state that the locals call Missouri is incredibly important to American history, not just its prehistory and its early colonial history, but also at the time that Missouri was becoming a state, it really was representative of the challenges that were facing the young nation in the early part of the 19th century, including a little-remembered conflict that nearly sparked a war between the states 20 years ahead of the Civil War. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Missouri was once a central part of the flourishing Mississippian culture that included a 13th century city that was comparable in size to the city of London at the time. The eastern border of the state is the Mississippi River, which means that Missouri saw contact with Europe earlier than you might think, so deep into North America. In fact, Missouri played a role in the American Revolution as part of the little-known Far Western Theater, where the British made raids across the Mississippi in hopes of controlling the river corridor, including a 1780 battle against what was then the tiny settlement of St. Louis, which had been founded by the French but was then under the control of the Spanish, who were allied with the Americans in their war for independence. Missouri became part of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and quickly Missouri demonstrated its position as the jumping-off point for all points west as the Corps of Discovery expedition under Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, charged by President Thomas Jefferson to explore the new territory, began their expedition there. Missouri would continue to be the dividing line between East and West, and the starting point of U.S. westward expansion. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the California Trail all originated in Missouri, as did the Pony Express. The group of fur traders called Ashley's 100 were recruited in Missouri and would go on to explore and map a great portion of the Mountain West. The connection to westward expansion today is memorialized by the 630-foot-tall Gateway Arch in St. Louis. Following Louisiana statehood in 1812, the remaining territory of the Louisiana Purchase was called Missouri Territory. When the Missouri legislature petitioned for statehood in 1818, the proposed state would not only have been the first U.S. state entirely west of the Mississippi River, but also the largest state in the Union at the time, larger even than Virginia, even though Virginia in that day still included the western counties that would eventually form the state of West Virginia. The borders of what would become the state of Missouri really represented the challenges of the time, from relations with other European powers that had interests in North America, to relations with the Native American nations, to the thorny issue in early U.S. history of slavery, and even natural disasters, which offered a unique challenge on the frontier. It's as if all the growing pains of the young nation were all represented in just this one state. The great Mississippi River has many meanders, those sinuous curves, bends, loops, turns, or windings in the channel of a river. One type of meander is called an oxbow, so called because of its distinctive crescent curve, and one such oxbow loop on the Mississippi creates the odd promontory that is the far southwestern corner of Kentucky, called Kentucky Bend. Across the river is the town of New Madrid. New Madrid, as the name applies, was a Spanish settlement, settled in Spanish territory in 1798. On February 7, 1812, the town was leveled by a massive earthquake, part of a series of earthquakes that are still the largest recorded to have hit the continental United States east of the Rocky Mountains. The earthquakes also spurred an exodus of the great majority of the settlers in the area of New Madrid, which ended up benefiting a landowner named John Hardiman Walker. Walker elected to stay in the New Madrid area and gradually increased his land holdings, acquiring the land of the people who chose to leave. In 1818, he controlled nearly 1,000 square acres in the area of New Madrid along the Kentucky Bend. When the territorial legislature applied for statehood, the proposed southern border of the state was to be the latitude line 3630, which formed the border between Kentucky and Tennessee. However, this placed Walker's land not in Missouri, but in the Arkansas Territory. Walker, a powerful political figure, argued that the Mississippi River communities had more in common with the river cities of Cape Girardeau and St. Louis than the Arkansas Territory, and successfully petitioned to have the area included as part of Missouri. It's unclear how much of a direct role Walker played in the decision, which seems to have been supported by the majority of the population, who depended upon the river trade and who preferred to join a state rather than be part of still Arkansas Territory. Some accounts suggest that the people of the area argued that Arkansas had a sickly reputation and was full of bears and panthers and copperhead snakes. Arkansas did not object to the change, so the border was dropped some 50 miles to the 36th parallel, which it follows until it hits the St. Francis River, which it follows back to the 3630 parallel. This creates the odd salient called the Missouri Bootheel. But the 3630, or parallel 36 and 1/2 degrees north of the equator, has another significance. That was a line drawn for the Missouri Compromise, and thus a line that theoretically divided the U.S. north and south. Because when the Missouri legislature petitioned for statehood in 1818, they raised one of the most divisive questions of the nation at the time. Missouri, which had a history of slavery going back to the French colonial period, asked to be admitted as a slave state. The question of slavery had plagued the nation since its founding, and the contest between those who wished to expand slavery, or at least let it be decided in each state by popular sovereignty, and those who looked to limit or abolish slavery, dominated national politics and threatened to cause the collapse of the Union. When Missouri asked to join the Union consisted of 22 states, 11 free states, and 11 slave states. The addition of another slave state would have shifted the legislative balance. In essence, the Missouri Compromise, struck in 1820, allowed the entry of Missouri as a slave state, under the condition that Maine, which had since 1677 been the huge northern section of Massachusetts, be allowed entry into the Union as a free state, thus maintaining the balance of power. In addition, the Missouri Compromise sought to prevent future such conflicts by agreeing that, with the exception of the borders of Missouri established in 1820, slavery would be prohibited in the land of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 parallel. That compromise helped to stave off the U.S. Civil War for more than 30 years. But there was a little-remembered violation of the Missouri Compromise with the Platte Purchase of 1836. When the state of Missouri was finally established in 1821, the western border was a straight line that was defined by the point on the left side of the Missouri River as it met the mouth of the Kaw, or what is today called the Kansas River. From that point, which is 94 degrees, 36 minutes west longitude, a line ran south and north, establishing a straight boundary between Kansas and Missouri. That placed a large section of land west of the longitude, but east of the Missouri River, that became important in the policy of Indian removal. In 1830, the U.S. had passed the Indian Removal Act. The purpose of the act was to negotiate with the native nations of the southern United States to trade their land for land west of the Mississippi. The goal was to prevent tension between the peoples, although it was of course also designed to acquire lands for settlement. The swath of land west of the Missouri border and east of the Missouri River was one such area reserved for relocation. In 1820, this was not an issue. White settlement in the area was sparse, and there was an imperative for new western states to have more manageable straight-line borders. But settlers quickly reached the land, and by 1831, there was already pressure to settle the area, raising the risk of war with the native nations. To stave off conflict, agents, including the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, William Clark, who had been one of the leaders of the Corps of Discovery expedition 40 years before, purchased the land from the Iowan and Sac and Fox nations, creating for them instead reservations in Nebraska and Kansas. Thus, the native peoples, some who had only been recently removed to that land, were again removed, and the area annexed to Missouri. This was not a small change. The land annexed in the Platte Purchase to what was already the largest state of the Union was almost as large as the states of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. As Missouri was a slave state, this amounted to an expansion of slavery north of the 3630 parallel, and thus a violation of the Missouri Compromise. Because it represented an expansion of territory where slavery was legal, the area was largely populated with settlers from slave states. But there was another, potentially explosive issue with the border of Missouri. The northern border had been defined in 1808 and 1815 treaties with the Osage Nation as the parallel of latitude which passes through the rapids of the River Des Moines. But the first attempt to survey the border in 1818 by surveyor John T. Sullivan went a tad awry. Sullivan apparently made an error by failing to account for the difference between magnetic and true north, and his line strayed northward, thus creating a slightly curved line. Then, when he reached the River Des Moines, he found no rapids. In reality, the latitude to which the treaty likely referred was the Des Moines Rapids of the Mississippi River, which was south of the Sullivan Line. Still, Sullivan defined a slightly less than straight line called the Sullivan Line. By 1837, the land along the border was being settled, and Missouri sent another surveyor to clarify the line. The surveyor, John C. Brown, started from the east end at the Des Moines River. However, finding no rapids that seemed to fit the treaty, he traveled north along the river until he found, in the generally calm river, a ripple that he decided, apparently rather randomly, presented the latitude defined in the treaty. Brown's line was, thus, about 9.5 miles north of the Sullivan Line. This created a strip of disputed land at the border of the state of Missouri and the newly created territory of Iowa. Determined to maintain the Brown Line, the line most advantageous for Missouri, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs ordered Missouri officials to travel north to the Brown Line and collect Missouri state taxes, hoping to cement his claim. Meanwhile, the governor of Iowa Territory, Robert Lucas, ordered officials to protect the state down to the Sullivan Line. Thus, when the sheriff of Clark County, Missouri, traveled north to collect taxes, he was arrested and jailed by the sheriff of Muscatine County, Iowa, on the charge of usurpation of authority. Angered, now both governors called upon units of the state militia to defend their interests, and Missouri and Iowa looked to be heading for a shooting war. The Iowa militia was brand new, and the men involved reportedly showed up with an odd assortment of weapons that included old blunderbusses, farm implements, and what was described as a sausage stuffer. The Missouri unit was a cavalry unit, and they were so ill-supplied that they had to rob a store in Missouri, which later had to be reimbursed for the loss. Fortunately, the leader of the Missouri militia, Major General David Willock, refused to start a war over an issue that should be decided by Congress. By the time the Iowa militia arrived, both states had agreed to allow Congress to decide the matter, and the Missouri militia had already gone home. Before they left, however, the disgusted Missouri militiamen had already killed both Governors Boggs and Lucas in effigy by hanging up 2 pieces of venison and shooting them with their muskets. Sandy Gregory, the Missouri sheriff who had been detained, was released, and the charges eventually dropped. The entire affair later was given a name over an event that may never even have occurred. According to legend, a tax collector from Missouri traveled north of the Sullivan Line and cut down 3 or 4 hollow trees filled with honeybees, claiming the honey as partial payment for the supposedly due taxes. Thus, the Iowa-Missouri War is usually called the Honey War. The border wasn't finally settled until 1849, when the issue Missouri versus Iowa reached the United States Supreme Court. The court finally decided to go back to the original, yet clearly flawed, Sullivan Line. It seems strange that just one U.S. state would have so many border disputes and changes that so represent the issues that were facing the nation at the time. But remember again, the United States is a very large nation. Missouri is the 21st largest state by size and the 18th largest state by population, but it is still larger than Greece and has a population bigger than Denmark. It played important roles in early U.S. history, in the American westward expansion, and during the U.S. Civil War. Something to keep in mind the next time that you fly over.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So the story of the creation of Missouri is really interesting, and you get to talk about really from the beginning to all the way to the modern era in this one, which is really a really interesting story. But I think especially as this episode recounts the story of that little Missouri boot heel, which is one of those just little odd pieces of geography, and I think it's just a really interesting story. What brought this story to your attention?
Well, I live just outside of Missouri, and I actually have sold insurance down in the Boot Heel, and so I mean that's where I got kind of the interest to it. It's really, I mean, the state in terms of borders, and every state's borders are interesting, but in terms of borders, because it really is. The measurement between east and west is still what's east and west of the Mississippi, and it was really the measurement between north and south in the conflict of the Civil War, and so it makes it particularly interesting. So that is just such a unique little story down there. It's related to the earthquake. It's related to politics. It's related to the river culture. It's related to their uncharitable feelings about Arkansas, and everybody would rather be a state than a territory. And when you put that all together, that someone had the political oomph to just put that little bump there and say this is Missouri and not Arkansas. It's just it's a neat little story, and it's fun. The people down the Boot Heel are very nice people, but it's just a very odd bit of geography that says a lot about American politics at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really interesting about Missouri is that it did end up being a part of all of this stuff, and I mean, central ultimately to the free versus slavery debate.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the Missouri Compromise is a centerpiece in what would eventually lead to the Civil War.
Yeah.
But also central to conflicts with Native Americans and central to expansion in the West. And I mean, it's for a state that I think is largely kind of forgotten sometimes. It's one of those flyover states. I mean, it played such a middle role. I mean, a central role in these very large events, and especially at the time. And that all ends up showing in the borders.
Yeah, I think the story of borders in general is really interesting. It's an interesting discussion, and I think that like you see here in Missouri, and in the other episode that we're going to talk about today, wherever those borders are, they're intimately tied to the history of the region, and this is true the world over. Wherever those borders are, so there's constantly, today we have constant political and historical discussions about borders, and I think it's always very interesting for how those borders were defined and derived, and whether it's always an open question on whether they're fair. But this one's such a great story because it really does show that clear impact of what those borders can have on history, because this was constantly the Missouri borders had to do with larger historical events, with local historical events. I think it's just a really, really cool story.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think a lot of people aren't familiar with it because they wouldn't even think about Missouri. But I mean, interesting too that its borders changed after it became a state twice. As well as one of those many, sort of petty, almost border wars between states. That there were quite a few of those in the periods the nation was growing. Yeah.
Yeah, that little the northwest corner of Missouri there. That's not something I thought about at all. That was something that was added later, but it's an interesting story.
And it's got its own unique population because that was the only place in the nation where slaveholders could expand north of the line, north of the Tennessee line, and so they are the Kentucky line, and so it's populated with Confederate expats, and that's who went up there, and it makes for a unique culture up. I mean, it's a wholly different place up there, and the people are different people than settled in other parts of Missouri, and it's really interesting that it was created, that was added at the point that it was added, and why the people went there, and it's really, I mean, it literally changed the population and the demographics as it changed the geography.
It's really, really interesting. Another thing that I found really interesting in this one was you were talking about Missouri was at the time the largest state in the Union. And it was quite a bit larger than a lot of those eastern states,
Delaware,
states in
Rhode
Delaware,
Island,
and again, that all has to do with the history of it. Those little states and how they were formed. But it is kind of as you move west on the map of the United States, it looks like we had all these like careful ideas of where borders were, and then we kind of just started getting lazy. And just being like, sure, just draw a line there, there.
It's interesting because it was a period when the real agenda from Congress was to try to make the line straight. They wanted to have straight, even readable lines. And of course, borders are going to follow geography. Borders have always followed rivers and things like that. So that just didn't always work out. It was a nice idea. It just didn't always work out. But yeah, as you go west, you had to have more and more land in order to collect the number of people that you needed in order to apply for statehood. And those were being carved out of the massive Louisiana territory and eventually Missouri territory and what was it, Nebraska territory after that. And so they start to get kind of weird, and they also start to be larger and larger states. But I mean, also, I mean, like, there was kind of a rush to turn California into a state, and now, obviously, you would think California should have been two states. If you look at the population, it probably doesn't treat the state properly. That's one state, and that's part of that was just it seemed the thing to do at the time.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. I don't know if they'll ever. California has so many different. It's so large and has so many different kind of sections.
Well, so large. I mean, it's not just geographically a very large state. It is. It's also very large economically, but it's also very large in terms of population. They would have better representation in Congress, and they would probably have a better ability to govern with their interests. If it was more than one state, there are various proposals to do that. Of course, it's hard to do, but it's possible. I mean, remember at the time that Missouri was created, the other large state in the Union was Massachusetts, and Massachusetts gave up a huge amount of its land in order for Missouri to become a state. Yes.
In one of the few, and I guess this is a little bit arguable, but it's one of the few states that was made up of something that was already a state. Maine,
yes,
and you could argue
from a state.
Virginia could argue that all the way across the country was originally them, but
that's true. And West Virginia, which is a unique story in itself, that's true. Yeah. But I mean that's the challenge. I mean, if say California wanted to be, or Texas, or whoever is geographically too large, part of the Constitution says that you can't carve a state from another state without that state's permission, and that can be very difficult to do. But it's not to say that it wouldn't happen. I mean, populations are going to continue to grow, and there might be more and more pressure for states to be able to do that.
It is difficult because even if you've got fairly strong local movements, you've got to get permission from the government. And of course, in California, that government that's focused more.
Well, there's always going to be. There's always going to be somebody who's got a vested interest the other way. I mean,
so it's difficult. But
the reason that Northern California complains about Southern California is that Southern California say takes their water. Southern California has to vote.
So you don't have access to that water. That's
So I mean, I think it would be politically very difficult, but not impossible that we will eventually create more states out of existing states, because we're seeing the demographics change to such that it makes sense. So you talk California a lot about it just because there's such a large population in Northern and Southern California, and they have different interests. That rethinking it, those always should have been two different states.
Yeah, and I've seen a number of there are actually quite a few kind of ideas for how that might happen. I've seen it split into more than two. But
I've seen 2 and 3 and other models, and there's all sorts of discussion. It's hard to move borders on states. I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime, but I mean, we might. There's also talk, of course, of Puerto Rican statehood and a DC statehood, and what to do with the Pacific territories. Does Guam prefer statehood, or does it prefer its unincorporated status? And it's hard to say what's going to happen over your lifetime. But we're in an era where it's been so long, it would be a shock to add a star to the flag.
Yeah, it was. I mean, when we added Alaska and Hawaii, it had been the state before that was Arizona, which I think was 1912 was the last state in the contiguous United States. And so, I mean, it was 40 years, and it did not necessarily seem likely for a rather large portion of that time that we'd add 2 more. But then. So I don't know. Now it's been even longer. So I don't know what exactly that looks like. But quite apart from any political discussion about it, it'll be interesting history if anyone lives through it.
That's why I mean the history of those borders in Missouri. I mean, what they do is they really represent everything that was occurring in the nation at the time, from the creation of the state, which was the jumping off point going west, to the way that it ended up being shaped, to the decision that it was a slave state, and eventually also to the conflict with Iowa. I mean, all that had to really do with the challenges of the nation at the time. So whatever happens going forward, you can guess it's going to be a seminal event that when you look back in the past, as a historian, when you look back at it, you'll be able to say this is really indicative of what was going on in the nation at the time. Yeah. And that's kind of fun because you don't always understand history as it occurs.
Yeah.
But I'm fairly sure that if in my lifetime we add a state, that we'll understand that is history, that is really something that we're going to remember.
For whatever reason we do it, it'll be a big deal, and I think I think it's cool to be a part of that history. Not that I'm likely to be in a place that wasn't a state and then became a state, but it's interesting. But making a state today would be very different from how we made them. When we were making Missouri. That was.
I'll believe it when I see it, and then I'll talk about it on the History Guy at least 15 years later. So that's that's the
at
line.
least 15 years later. That's the line. So, we this one ends up being such an interesting story because it goes through all these various political machinations. But the Honey War, up there between Iowa and Missouri, which is again interesting because it's a war that's based on probably a mythical event, but it's not at all the first battle.
Named after the honey trees that might not have happened, and
Yeah.
There's several of these, and there were also some with Canada that were fairly similar too.
Yeah.
I mean, Britain too, over in Vancouver with the San Juan War, and that I mean, it just comes down to, even when you go to define borders, there's always question: does it go to this side of the channel or that side of the channel? I mean, that one it went to instead it went to a rapids, it wasn't a rapids. No one knew where to go. The surveyor was just a little bit, you're off 1 inch. That magnifies as you go over time.
Yeah, as
it's
you go over 1 inch
and
for over 100 miles, suddenly it's
and it's funny that we're at this point where they were literally willing to fight over. I mean, that was mostly not occupied. I mean, they literally fought over the honey trees. They're cutting down honey trees to take the honey as taxes. So I mean, it's kind of funny that they were willing. But I mean, states were new. And if they were not assertive, then they literally were at threat from other states around them. And so it's another bit. The honey war is another bit of this is kind of where the nation sat at the time.
Yeah. Well, and that was even a problem when they were making the country, because those the royal charters and stuff were not clear.
Yeah, we're not accurate.
There were overlapping. I mean, we talked about Vermont, which is another story of that, where New Hampshire thought that should be theirs, and New York thought that should be theirs, and people in Vermont thought they should be neither one of them. And
and we're an independent state for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, they're interesting stories about how they get in fights over these particular regions.
A lot of wars are over territory. When they're over territory, they're over something of economic value, and this was indicative of that. But it also shows, I mean, how imprecise. I mean, we really thought, that you would think that we would know where the border is, and actually, when you were surveying with a chain and looking
trying to make a straight line,
and trying to make a straight line over hundreds of miles, it wasn't exact. It never was. And even if you look in the more exact term, because obviously the eastern border of Missouri is the Mississippi River, but the Mississippi River changes and moves, and there are examples of. I mean, there's a little town that's in Missouri, but you can't get there from Missouri. You have to go into Illinois to do it. It's on the other side of the river now.
It's an interesting question, and those will continue to be, those kinds of things will be political fights. I mean, in China, there's the one river will change dramatically where it goes, and so the Mississippi hasn't done that quite as dramatically, but it will move, and that'll continue to be, as long as there's a border between Illinois and Missouri, that's where that river goes.
And there's still disputed territory. It's between Egypt and South Sudan. Is that right?
There is a chunk there.
Because it's an argument over two pieces of disputed territory. There's a piece of land that neither will claim, that is actually unclaimed territory. Because if either of them pushes a claim there, then they would lose a claim.
They're giving up the claim to another little corner. Which is a really interesting. It's one of the only places in the world that there's literally no sovereignty that claims it. But it's also, I mean, it's like incredibly marginal land. The whole point is that it's not worth as much as the other chunk of land that they want.
I think has a mineral use to it. Yeah. Well, at some point, if humans are around long enough, then the continents are going to move and bump into each other, and then we'll have to figure out what are we going to do.
It's going to cause all kinds of problems.
When we do on a new Pangea, I think we'll probably have worse problems than.
That'll be hopefully, that we won't be talking about. Well, they'll be talking about some kind of borders if there's humans still there. I think that everyone's always... that goes down to people fighting over property lines. About all the
volcanoes that are killing everybody by that point. But but I mean, it's... geography does change. It actually physically changes. And when it does, what does that mean? Because, many refugee crises are caused by exactly that. Because something happened in climate or geography, and a land that was, once this is now that, and that leads to crisis. And we'll continue to have to deal with a changing planet.
Yeah, whether California decides to slowly move its way off and become an island, or the shores are always eroding away and stuff like that. So
I was always told when I was a kid that an earthquake was going to come and drop California into the sea.
It seems like there's still a chance of that. Every once in a while we get a movie.
I'm not sure that's true. Every once in a while you get, and so when you talk about the borders of Missouri and you see how much politics is involved in geography, then you can see that's going to continue, and those are lessons from the past that are going to be meaningful today.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
You know what? I went to watch it. It's always fun on Magellan TV, and I watch it a lot. And then we also have to, watch it a lot for the business. But I happen to watch this one. It's called City Slickers Penguin Invasion, and it was honestly just because the thumbnail was attractive to me. But the idea is way at the tip of South Africa, there's these African penguins. And it was the population there had almost gone extinct for various reasons, but partly because the guano had been mined and they use that for nesting. Well, they've managed to help that population recover now to the point where there's so many penguins that they are wandering into the city. And it's fun. It's a nature documentary. It talks a lot about how the ecology of these penguins, and it talks about it from the perspective of a penguin named Henry. But it also is really a story about the difficulty of having man living next to nature. These penguins are protected, and they want to dig under your porch and raise young and yell. And people have to figure out how to live around the penguins. The penguins have to figure out how to live around people. So it's really interesting. And it's also it's a lot of fun. I mean, penguin antics are always fun to watch. It's called City Slickers Penguin Invasion. I really, really enjoyed it.
Gosh, that sounds really interesting, and I think a lot of people can relate to that, whether it's maybe not with penguins, but raccoons and various other things that are always getting in the way.
Woodchucks. We had the woodchucks. Yeah.
So what I watched was actually, it was kind of a more typical history documentary. It is part of a 2-episode series called Blood Money, Inside the Nazi Economy, and it's actually really, really interesting. The first episode is called A World War on Credit, and it talks about how the Germans went from essentially, during the Depression, when Germany was suffering almost as much as, maybe more than almost any other country, and how they kind of turned that around, and how they put their money and their economy into armament, despite the fact that was specifically outside the rules of the Treaty of Versailles and all this stuff. And it's really, really interesting. For one, I think it's amazing how there was some true brilliance there. But also, I think it's really indicative of really the story of the Nazis and how they ruled. And ultimately, how their ruling was always so caught up within their own ideologies that it was always handicapped by that. So again, it's called Blood Money Inside the Nazi Economy. It's really, really worth watching. And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you, sometimes a free month or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, the History Guy talks about the Toledo War, a war in which Ohio and Michigan started fighting and Wisconsin lost. And stay tuned after the episode to hear us chat a little more with the History Guy.
It was 1835, and it looked like war was on the horizon. A force of more than 1,000 troops had arrived in disputed territory, occupying the largest town in the area, make it the center of their defense. The townspeople may have had their own opinions over who the land belonged to, but they knew that their future depended upon which army could defend their claim. Just to the south, another force had arrived to defend their position over who owned the disputed territory. The forces represented the state of Ohio and the then territory of Michigan. And the land over which they were preparing to go to war was the then small town of Toledo. After decades of uncertainty, the state and the territory were now prepared to defend with force of arms their respective positions over where the border between them lay. What has become now called the Toledo War was at its climax and threatening to lead to bloodshed all over a nearly 50-year-old incorrect map. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The issues that would eventually cause the Toledo War have their origins in 1787, when the Congress of the Confederation passed the Northwest Ordinance, creating the Northwest Territory in the land northwest of the Ohio River. The eastern boundary of the territory was the Mississippi River, and its northern border was defined by British Canada and the Great Lakes. The act stipulated that this territory would eventually be divided into no less than 3 and no more than 5 states. The act also defined what the border between what would become Michigan and the states south of it would be: an east and west line drawn through the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan. In 1800, the territory was split for the first time by a line that ran down the center of the lower Michigan Peninsula to the Ohio River. The eastern part was renamed the Territory of Ohio, while the western section was renamed Indiana Territory. The 1787 ordinance required 60,000 inhabitants for any part of the territory to apply for statehood, and the 1800 census counted 45,000 in the Ohio Territory. Anticipating that they would soon reach the 60,000, the inhabitants of Ohio began pushing for statehood. In 1802, Congress passed an Enabling Act, which established procedures for statehood and authorized the territory to hold a constitutional convention. The Enabling Act defined the northern boundary of Ohio as an east and west line drawn through the southerly extreme of Lake Michigan, running east until it shall intersect Lake Erie. It was this statement and the errors of the map on which it was based that would become the crux of disagreement. The Mitchell map, upon which the Ordinance of 1787 was based, was wrong about where the southern tip of Lake Michigan was, placing it significantly further north. Based on the Mitchell map and the text of the Enabling Act, the state of Ohio would have had control over the whole western shoreline of Lake Erie. But if the wording was used to draw a line from the actual tip of Lake Michigan, it would be much further south. During the convention, delegates had actually heard that the Mitchell map could be incorrect and sought to secure the control over as much of the Erie shoreline as possible, by including a provision that said that if the older map was incorrect, then Ohio's northern border would end at least as far as the most northerly cape of the Maumee Bay, which would include what became the city of Toledo. But Congress elected not to address the provision, and 2 years later, when they established the Territory of Michigan, they used the original wording from the 1787 Ordinance. Residents of the area that would become Toledo were aware that it was unclear exactly where the border lay, and they pressed Ohio to have the line surveyed. The Ohio legislature passed repeated resolutions pressing Congress to make a final determination for the state's northern border, which was to be done in 1812, just in time to be delayed by the War of 1812. It was only after the admission of Indiana in 1816 that a survey team was finally sent. The U.S. Surveyor General was Edward Tiffin, who had been the first governor of Ohio. He dispatched William Harris to survey the line as it was defined in the Ohio Constitution, which found the border to be north of the Maumee River. When the Harris line was made public, it infuriated Lewis Cass, governor of the Michigan Territory. President Monroe commissioned a new survey, this time based on the congressionally approved 1787 Ordinance line. This survey found that the border should lie south of the Maumee River. This created a piece of land that became known as the Toledo Strip, although Toledo wouldn't become a city until 1833, when two towns merged and chose the new name. The strip was 5 to 8 miles wide, and both Michigan and Ohio claimed it. Though Ohio refused to cede their claims, Michigan largely governed the area after 1818, building roads and collecting taxes in the area. But conflict was brewing. The Toledo Strip promised to be an important economic boon to whoever controlled it. Before trains, the best means of travel across the country was by water, enabled by the digging of canals. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 immediately turned Buffalo, New York into a boom town, making the city a hub of trade moving east from the Midwest. There were plans at the time to build a series of canals that would connect the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes, and Ohio hoped that the Maumee River and the western shores of Lake Erie would become an important stop on that journey. The land was also very fertile, providing excellent soil for crops that could be sent east. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson appointed John Mason Secretary of the Michigan Territory. John's son, 19-year-old Stevens Mason, was a natural politician and helped his father negotiate with anti-Jackson forces in the state. When John was sent on a mission to Mexico, Jackson named Stevens as his father's replacement. Lewis Cass was then named Jackson's Secretary of War, which made Stevens the acting territorial governor, before he had turned 20. The new governor was often absent, and Stevens earned the nickname Boy Governor. Mason was an active supporter of Michigan statehood, and the state voted on October 1, 1832, to seek admittance to the Union. Congress was then supposed to pass an Enabling Act, as it had for Ohio, but the Ohio delegation blocked it. Former President John Quincy Adams, then in Congress, sided with Michigan and wrote, "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right was so clearly on one side and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other. Michigan could do little about it." Upset at being ignored, in 1834 the territory held a census that showed there were 86,000 people in Michigan, more than what was necessary to apply for statehood. The dispute over the strip began to heat up. On February 12, 1835, at Mason's instigation, the Michigan territorial governor passed an act to prevent the organization of a foreign jurisdiction within the limits of the territory of Michigan, or the Pain and Penalties Act, which criminalized any attempt for Ohioans to carry out governance in the Strip. This was in response to a plan by Ohio, which was passed 12 days later, that the Strip should be organized and that townships therein should hold elections in April. The act also enabled a remaking of the border along Ohio's claim. Mason immediately sent a letter to General Joseph Brown. You will perceive that a collision between Michigan and Ohio is inevitable, and therefore will be prepared to meet the crisis. Brown and around 1,000 militia were dispatched to Toledo. On March 31st, Ohio Governor Robert Lucas arrived in Perrysville, about 10 miles south of Toledo, with General John Bell and some 600 Ohio militia. Both sides were now prepared to defend their claim. Back in Congress, Ohio continued to refuse to allow any discussion of Michigan's statehood until the boundary dispute was settled, in their own favor, of course. Michigan decided that they would proceed even without congressional approval and elected delegates for a constitutional convention. President Jackson was being pressured to get involved, but he didn't want to alienate the 21 Ohio members of Congress. His attorney general, though, sided with Michigan's interpretation. Jackson sent 2 representatives to find a compromise. They decided that Michigan should allow Ohio to resurvey the line and that the region should run itself until Congress came up with a solution. Ohio held local elections in the Strip 3 days later, and so Michigan refused to disband its militia. Thinking that things had cooled down, Ohio sent its survey team to mark their version of the border. On April 26th, the survey party was resting in a field when a posse of Michiganders appeared to arrest them. According to the Ohio party, while enjoying the blessings of the Sabbath, some 50 Michigan militia appeared to arrest them. Outnumbered and with only a few armed men, the nervous surveyors fled while under fire. 9 of our men, who did not leave the ground in time after being fired upon by the enemy, from 30 to 50 shots, were taken prisoners and carried away. Most of the 9 would be released on bail. The Michiganders said that the Ohioans had drawn weapons first, and that the Michiganders had only fired a few shots in the air as a warning after the fleeing men. The encounter came to be named the Battle of Phillips Corners. Governor Lucas, infuriated, pushed through a number of laws in the Ohio legislature to make Toledo the seat of a newly named Lucas County, to form a court of appeals there, and to provide $300,000 to implement the legislation. Michigan immediately appropriated $315,000 to support their own militia. Michigan drafted a constitution during the summer and set up a functional state government that would first meet in November. Congress still refused to admit the state, and President Jackson vowed to reject admission until the dispute was resolved. A report that 10,000 able militia were available in Ohio became exaggerated as it went north, until Michigan promised to welcome the Ohio Million to hospitable graves. During the summer, the two sides arrested each other's partisans and generally brawled over the Strip, spying on rival sheriffs and trying to govern the area. Michigan law officers sought to arrest Ohio supporter Major Benjamin Stickney in Toledo, which they did only after a major scuffle with his family. They had to physically tie the major to his horse to transport him to jail. Deputy Sheriff Joseph Wood attempted to arrest Stickney's younger son, who was named Two, brother of one Stickney, and in the ensuing fight, Two stabbed Wood with a penknife. Though only minorly injured, Wood was carried from the scene while the two fled into Ohio. Michigan charged Stickney with assault, but Governor Lucas would not send him to Michigan and argued that the crime was committed in Ohio and that Michigan had no authority to try to Stickney anyway. Trying to get things back under control, and thanks to the pressure of Ohio's congressman, Jackson removed Mason from his position as governor. But while his replacement was on the way, Mason ordered the Michigan militia to enter Toledo and arrest a number of Ohioans who were holding a symbolic court of appeals. By the time the militia arrived, they learned that the Ohio men had held court in the early hours of the morning and fled back across the Maumee River. Mason remained incredibly popular in Michigan, and despite his replacement arriving, the territory approved its constitution and elected Mason their first governor in October 1835. And for a time, Michigan was led by two governments. They sent 2 senators and a representative to Congress, but the men weren't allowed to take their seats. Though scuffles continue, Michigan couldn't afford to continue the standoff. The cost of maintaining the militia was quickly eating into what funds they had, and without support of the federal government, they had little ability to raise more. On June 15, 1836, Jackson signed a bill that would admit Michigan as a state, but only if it gave up its claim to the Toledo Strip. In exchange, Michigan would be given the 9,000 square miles of the western 3/4 of the Upper Peninsula. The easternmost quarter was already part of the territory. At the time, the Upper Peninsula was considered worthless, a land of perpetual snow that was destined by soil and climate to remain forever a wilderness. A special convention in Ann Arbor rejected the compromise. But desperation and opportunity have a way of changing opinions. A large surplus from the federal government was about to be distributed to the states, but not territories. A second convention was held in Ann Arbor in December, during a notable cold spell that passed a resolution to accept the congressional proposal. It isn't even clear if the convention was legal. The legislature had not called for one, and Michigan Whigs boycotted it. The cold and the controversy gave the meeting its name, the Frostbitten Convention. Despite questions of legality, Congress chose to recognize the resolution and officially grant Michigan its Upper Peninsula and statehood, while granting Ohio the coveted Toledo Strip. Michigan was made the 26th state on January 26, 1837. At first, Michiganders thought that they had lost the war, but that attitude changed in the 1840s with the discovery of iron and copper ore deposits in the Upper Peninsula. And those metals, as well as timber, earned fortunes for the state that at first thought that they had inherited only perpetual wilderness. Disagreements over the border actually continued into the 20th century until a resurvey in 1915 was done that put the matter to rest. The state governors shook hands across the finalized border to symbolize the end of the conflict. Some Ohio counties still follow the old state line, and there exists near Toledo an old state line road that follows along some of the original line that had been claimed by Michigan. In 1973, a new dispute arose over where the state borders went through Lake Erie, and the Supreme Court eventually resolved the dispute in favor of the wording in the Ohio Constitution and split the uninhabited Turtle Island between the two states. Interestingly, the real loser of the Toledo War might not have been Michigan or Ohio, but Wisconsin, because absent the compromise that gave Michigan the Upper Peninsula, that land likely would have been part of Wisconsin when they eventually applied for statehood.
So after watching both of these episodes, after hearing them, one of the things I think we take for granted today, and we kind of mentioned it a little bit in the last one, is cartography and surveying. It seems something fairly mundane, but it's actually, now we've got like satellite pictures. We know what everything looks like. But man, if you're a dude who's just trying to use trigonometry and measurements to draw a coastline or a border, as we saw, it's an imperfect science. And I think these days, we think we know where all of our borders are, but boy, it sure has led to a lot of conflict.
Well, they didn't know where Lake Michigan ended. And they were making decisions, based on the Treaty of Paris. Congress is making decisions based on an absolutely inaccurate map about where the Great Lakes sat. But I mean, you can see when you're off wandering in the wilderness. I mean, it's extraordinary what people were able to map in the 18th century, or even the 17th century. It's extraordinary where they were able to go and the accuracy they were able to measure to. But I mean, it always was subject to error. And then when you go, to parcel that later, then again it leads to conflict. It's almost surprising that we've never actually gotten into a shooting war with Canada or the UK over the border with Canada, and we did get into a shooting war with Mexico over the border with Mexico.
We've gotten quite close a number of times. I think that I just actually wrote an episode that'll be up here soon that talks about fighting over where the border was from Spain. Spain fighting over the border all over the place, and that
almost ended in a general war in Europe over way off in one of the most remote places on the world because they're both claiming the territory.
Really, so that'll be a really interesting story. But I mean, constantly they fight over this stuff, and I imagine we will tell probably many more stories that end up dealing with various borders, because it ends up driving just a lot of history, how that border was drawn, how people fight over it. This one's such an interesting story where it's clear they all knew that the border was not drawn correctly. We figured out where Lake Michigan was. We knew that there was a section of land that wasn't surveyed in a way that was clear, and it just kept getting pushed back.
It is interesting. I mean, one of the interesting parts of the story is that Ohio from the start was saying, Congress, you need to resolve this before this turns into a conflict. And Congress just ignored it until it turned into a conflict. And then Jackson really couldn't do much about it because Ohio was part of Congress and it was too big a part of Congress. And so then the federal government was kind of stuck without the ability to do something about it. But I mean, like every other crisis, they eventually come to a compromise. They
do.
They got to do.
And again, without terrible bloodshed, even though they certainly threatened it a bit.
Yeah, but I mean, Ohio wins in the end because they had leverage and Michigan did not.
Yes.
I mean, Jackson had leverage over Michigan, but Ohio had leverage over Jackson because Ohio had a congressional delegation and Michigan was seeking entry into the.
Yeah, Michigan didn't really have any say in terms of how that was going to work. Not politically.
Eventually that's how it was resolved in the end. It says if you want to be a state, then you're going to do it this way because otherwise Ohio's never going to let you enter the
Jackson. It would have been very foolish of Jackson to endanger, his own reelection, but also his party, to stand in front of Ohio. Ohio was a significant chunk of the votes, and that could have been enough to, if you turn it against them, even if they don't switch parties, but they're just like, okay, if you're not going to give us what we want, then we're going to block your what you want to do in Congress. They probably had enough people to do that.
It is funny though because the compromises that came actually, when you look at it today, appears just ridiculous. It makes no sense at all that the Upper Peninsula is part of Michigan rather than Wisconsin, where it's actually connected. It's they had to have a compromise, and so it is such a bizarre story that Ohio and Michigan went to war and Wisconsin lost.
I always liked that, and it's one of those questions. This silly question of when you look at Michigan, you're like, how did it get like that? How on earth did it end up like that? But it's also, they clearly were like, they're fighting over like this 7-mile strip, 7-mile wide strip, and so we're going to give them this enormous chunk of land. But we think that enormous chunk of land is probably worth
really
nothing.
Kind of nowhere near, and you can only get there by boat. But and it turns out that the chunk of land, is well. There's, if you look at the comments on that video, they're kind of derogatory of Toledo. Most of them are like, can we give it back? Which I've been to Toledo. It's a perfectly nice place. I don't think that's fair at all. But it certainly did turn out, at least, that the UP had a lot more economic value than Michigan realized, so that they didn't have to feel as like they lost everything. Because the whole idea there was, connection over to Lake Erie that would connect you out to, and at the time that looked like that's where all of the economic value was going to be.
Yeah. And I don't know that, we did a story not that long ago talking about canals going through Ohio and going through Indiana, and so there, for a while that's why they thought Toledo was so valuable, was they thought as a port moving stuff east. And I think that I don't know the details for sure, but I'm sure Toledo has played some role in economics and stuff for Ohio. I've actually never been to Toledo, but I don't particularly have anything bad to say about it. It is a little funny that it's not really like this a city famous for being pretty or anything like that. And boy, but it was at one point.
It's very much a Midwest city and an industrial city, and certainly a city that had a lot of history and industry.
It's interesting that there was such a fight over it. It's not something that you look back today and think, yes, this is a place worth fighting over, but they did. And just like you said, with Missouri, when you had to be aggressive if you wanted to push those claims. And of course, Ohio understands that this is the only piece of land that they're going to get to fight over. Ohio's not going to expand into Kentucky or Indiana or anything like that. They're stuck with the space they've got, and yet you want to, as a person who's in Ohio, you want to bring prosperity to your state, and so you're going to fight for every piece of it. And man, Michigan, for being so much weaker politically, John Quincy Adams says that all the power was with one person. He also says all the right was with Michigan, and I think there's some argument there. But certainly the power was with Ohio, and Michigan put up as big a fight as they could, and ultimately, historically, I think we'd say they got out of it pretty
governor,
well.
They put up the fight. It's an interesting bit of history there. There's just tenacity from the Wolverines. Yeah.
And it was a serious disagreement. They were willing to fight over it. It's funny that the folks in that strip and in Toledo, not just Ohio, but also them, were like, please tell us which where we are. Are we in Ohio or are we in Michigan? Because we know this is going to be a problem.
They had partisans on both sides, and then a lot of people saying we don't want to be in the middle of a war where two states are taxing us and we don't know who the sheriff is.
Certainly, you don't want to be.
It did actually lead to violence with a penknife, and it was. You can imagine that most of the people in the strip there, just said, "Just tell us which." We don't really care.
Yeah, whoever's going to tax
some
us.
Some who cared. Some who was very important to, and they. But that they would sneak across at night and try to rule, and then they would run back across the river in the morning.
Yeah, we're gonna make some judge, because they're all trying to make that claim, and they're trying to have whatever the strongest claim is. So if you can say, well, we've been we've been being, doing judicial decisions there, then clearly we're the ones with the power. But also, I mean, Ohio had been essentially running the place the whole time. Michigan, it didn't, I mean, for a while, Michigan didn't have anything. Ohio had a government before Michigan did, really. And so that, that fight over it. But Michigan decides to name it a new county and stuff. I mean, they were all fighting over it. And there is, and I think part of what makes this story great is that there's just a hint of ridiculousness to it. The idea of a war over Toledo, the whole concept of a Toledo strip, and it looks, you look on a map and it's just such a tiny little section of land.
Yeah, it is.
You think, what could be?
Angle, yeah.
But then there's also the dude who stabbed a guy. His name was Two.
Two, yeah.
His brother was One. His name was Two Stickney. And we make fun of this, of this idea of of giving people weird names, but he literally named his kids One and Two, and and I think his daughters had some ridiculous names too. But man, and then they're fighting over.
Was he trying to be counterculture, or was he trying to start a trend? Honestly, I don't know. But
I have no idea.
And the stabbing was with his pocket knife, with his penknife, and there's a
they
lot
carried
of
the guy
to
out.
the story. But I mean, they were really willing to go to war. They really were under arms.
They were arresting each other.
I don't think that anybody involved wanted to kill someone over it. I don't think that any of the militia ever wanted to kill anybody over anything like that. So I mean, it was all saber rattling, and as it turned out, I mean, both states
made
seemed
it
to operate.
It took them apparently nearly another 100 years before they finally agreed. All right, this is where the border is, which does remind me there was between Belgium and I think France. There's like a line of rocks that they put in there several hundred years ago. They put these rocks there and like, this is where the border is. And some farmer who owned land, right on the border there, moved one of the rocks because it was in his way. And the that was reported widely as he moved a rock and he moved the border of Belgium because he was, and I think probably legally we wouldn't say that, but this was a rock that was supposed to stand for that, and this guy's like, look, I'm trying to dig a hole here, and this freaking rock is in my way.
I cannot grow corn where the rock is standing. Yeah.
So there's so many stories.
It gets back to, in some ways it's ridiculous to think about the whole concept of borders, because wherever you live, there's the land around you, but you have to have governance somehow, and then you have to defend borders. And
who's in charge?
It certainly shows there were so many of those conflicts in the United States as the states were forming, and they were looking to the long run and their economic viability.
Yep.
We also talked about North and South Dakota, which was another interesting one. And
that one was really interesting because that there was a real chance that those would have been just one state. And the idea that there's this story about there's a lot of bad blood between North and South Dakota. At the very least, it was certainly true at one point that the people in North Dakota and the people in South Dakota could not stand the idea of being in the same state
together. Well, and it's really interesting because it was a question of one state, but they had two capitals and they couldn't agree on which, so they just made two states. It's crazy, but it's all, and again, it's all tied up to the politics of the time and the local politics and those authorities, just like the Bootheel of Missouri, who has power at the time, and that makes for these odd disagreements. And it's kind of funny because is the borders between the states that important right now? I don't know. I honestly don't know, because you cross borders in the United States so easily.
Yeah, and there are some rules that are different, but in general, we all live under very similar laws. It's not usually like you're going into a different country, when you cross a border, but there are different rules in different places.
Yeah, there are, and whether you're in the county or you're in the city, I guess it all does make a difference. But the fact that we had these fights over what appear to be just small lines on a map, it's kind of hard.
Really narrow ones too. But as the truth is, as we got nowadays, we can really define some lines, although there's still problems. And like we talked about with Egypt and Sudan fighting over some section of lands that nobody wants and another section that everybody wants. We continue to do that. And there's been up in between India, China, and Pakistan, there's been fighting over borders over there forever. It's difficult to know how and if those will ever resolve themselves. But there's more border stories to tell. There's actually, I know there's a little bit of a story
honestly,
between.
There's people fight over their neighbor's property and where
property lines.
My garage actually goes over the property line. What do you do? Mine doesn't. I'm not saying that, but that stuff happens all the time.
Yeah.
And so it's it's amazing how important those lines can be, and these are examples of it. What you find out in both the Toledo War and in the Honey War is that no one really wanted to shoot each other over it, and that they were able to come to an agreement without a shooting war because probably the militias on both sides weren't willing to actually fight over this.
Well, they were usually rarely well armed, and they were not particular. The idea was just that they were supposed to show a force.
In the Honeybee War, a guy showed up with a sausage stuffer. That's what
they just had whatever they could grab.
He just found the biggest metal object in his house and said, "I'll club someone from Missouri with this."
I'll do it. So ultimately, I mean, people got fired up about it, and they got fired up enough that they tried to arrest two Stickney, and he stabbed you, and then ran off into Michigan, and they wouldn't let you charge him. But ultimately, no one was really. I don't think anyone was really willing to kill each other, and I think that if it had, no one would have been happy about it.
I do not think that these militia units would actually have stood and fired for this cause that they didn't believe in, and so the ridiculousness of it, I think, showed at the time. But in all cases, by being serious, then they were able to get some negotiating power, which made a difference in terms of what happened in the future. And I mean, that's what those governors were apparently standing for. It wasn't just principle. Yeah. They were standing for real economic meaning to their state. And even sometimes knowing that they were going to lose this, they thought they would gain something in return. But I mean, it just seems crazy. We fight over where Michigan and Ohio end. We fight over where Missouri and Iowa. I mean,
it doesn't seem like these days. I've driven across that border between Iowa and Missouri a number of times, and it doesn't seem like that important a spot.
There's no cities of it. I mean, it's pretty rural up there. It's like this is what we were fighting over. I mean, who cares which county you're in? And I mean, they did. And I mean, they're both interesting stories. They both have their kind of inherent comedy ridiculousness in them, but they do both represent, I mean, real interest, people in real interest who were not that they sent our people out to do it, and that tells us a lot about interesting history. So hopefully we will have no more potential shooting wars between the borders of states in the United States. Hopefully we're past that era.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.